I was never the kind of person to go camping alone. It wasn't fear that stopped me. It was just that I always thought camping was something best done with friends. Sitting around a fire, drinking, telling stories. It felt pointless without someone else there. But after months of stress at work, I decided I needed the silence. No people, no voices, just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, a place far away from the usual campsites. It was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment, followed by another hour of hiking. I found the location online, an old trail not many people used anymore. The photos showed a clearing next to a small stream, surrounded by thick pines. It looked perfect. I packed everything carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 nights, a small axe for chopping wood, a hunting knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and my old bolt-action rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I always brought it on trips like this. Out there, miles from civilization, you never knew what you might run into. Bears, mountain lions, or even other people who didn't want you there. The drive was long but peaceful. The roads wound through dense forests, the trees pressing in on both sides. The last stretch was rough, a dirt road full of potholes, but my truck handled it fine. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in some spots. I had to push through thick brush, my pack weighing me down. The sun was starting to dip by the time I reached the clearing. It was exactly like the pictures. Flat ground, plenty of space for a tent, and the stream running a few yards away. The water was clear, moving lazily over smooth stones. I set up my tent near the tree line, facing the stream. After gathering wood, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and beef jerky. The quiet was strange at first. No cars, no distant hum of electricity. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. I sat by the fire watching the last bit of light fade. The forest changed when the sun went down. The sounds were different. More movement in the brush, more snapping twigs. I told myself it was just small animals, raccoons, maybe a deer, but there was something about the way the noises would start, then stop suddenly like something was waiting, listening. I ignored it and went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, ears straining for sounds outside the tent. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not an animal, something bigger. But when I held my breath and listened, everything was silent. I told myself it was just my imagination. The forest played tricks on people, especially when they were alone. The next morning, I woke up early, stiff from the cold. The fire had burned down to embers, so I got up to restart it. That's when I noticed something was off. The pile of firewood I had stacked the night before was scattered. Not just knocked over, but spread out like someone had kicked it around. A few pieces were even farther away, near the trees. I frowned, looking around. No tracks, no signs of animals. If a bear had done it, there would be claw marks, something. I shook it off and made breakfast. The rest of the day was normal. I hiked a bit, fished in the stream, just enjoying the quiet. By evening, I had mostly forgotten about the firewood. That night, though, the feeling came back, that sense of being watched. I was sitting by the fire, sharpening my knife, when I heard it. Movement in the trees. Slow, steady footsteps. I turned, staring into the darkness, but saw nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods. The beam cut through the trees, but nothing was there. Then I saw it. A shape, just at the edge of the light, ducking behind a tree. It was fast, too fast to be an animal. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Hello!" I almost called out, but stopped myself. Something felt wrong. I turned off the flashlight and backed toward my tent, keeping my rifle close. I sat there for hours listening. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion won. I climbed into my tent but kept my rifle next to me. Sleep was light, broken by every little sound. At some point, I woke up to a new noise. Breathing. Not mine. It was just outside the tent. Slow, steady, right against the fabric. I grabbed my rifle and held my breath. The breathing continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Silence. Then, slow footsteps moving away. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, everything looked normal. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. Just stuffed everything into my bag and started hiking back. The whole way I felt it. Someone watching me. The trees seemed too quiet, the air too still. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors as fast as I could. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was real. It didn't move. It just watched me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and got the hell out of there. I don't know who it was. A hermit? A hunter? Someone who lived out there, waiting for people like me to wander in too deep? I don't know, but I never went back. I had been camping since I was a teenager. It was never anything extreme, just a way to escape for a few days, to be somewhere quiet. I wasn't a survivalist or anything like that, just someone who liked the woods. This trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just 3 nights out in the forest, alone. I had done it plenty of times before. There was a stretch of land about 100 miles from where I lived, mostly untouched, deep enough that I wouldn't see another person the entire time. It wasn't an official campsite, just public land that didn't see much foot traffic. The last time I had been out there was almost a year ago, and I remembered thinking how peaceful it was. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small hatchet, my knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my rifle. I didn't always bring a gun on camping trips, but this area was remote. I had never seen a bear out here, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed the highway until it turned into a smaller road, then finally a dirt path that wound through the trees. My truck handled it fine, but I could feel every bump, every dip in the road. Eventually, I reached a spot where I had parked before, just a small clearing off the path. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees. I grabbed my pack and locked up the truck. The hike in was only a couple of miles, but the terrain was rough in places. No real trails, just old deer paths cutting through the undergrowth. I had my GPS, though, and I wasn't worried about getting lost. It took about an hour to reach the spot. A small clearing, maybe 20 yards across, bordered by thick trees. A shallow creek ran nearby, which meant I wouldn't have to use much of my bottled water. I had camped here before, and it looked the same as I remembered. Undisturbed. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that nothing would fall on me if a storm rolled in. After gathering firewood, I started a small fire and cooked some food. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, but the fire helped. As the sun dipped lower, I sat by the fire and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was mostly quiet, an occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds. I didn't feel uneasy, not yet, but something was different. Took me a while to put my finger on it, but then I realized. The woods were too quiet. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that even at night, the forest is never completely silent. There are always insects, small animals moving in the brush. But now there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the wind through the trees. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the temperature had dropped just enough to keep the bugs away. Maybe the wind had shifted, making it harder to hear the usual night sounds. Still, I kept my rifle close as I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. At some point in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and outside, everything was still. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavier. They stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe more than that. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal. No broken branches, no footprints. I started to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day trying to shake the feeling. I gathered more wood, checked the area for any signs that someone had been nearby. But there was nothing. By evening, I had convinced myself it was nothing, just paranoia. Then, as I was sitting by the fire, sharpening my knife, I noticed something. The trees just beyond the clearing, something was there. Not moving, just standing. Couldn't make out details. It was too far, and the light was fading. But there was a shape. Human. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, staring into the trees. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. The shape shifted, almost like it was stepping back into the darkness. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, my rifle across my lap. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew better. At some point, just before dawn, I heard something behind my tent. A deep, slow breathing. Not mine. I turned, gripping my rifle, but by the time I crawled out of the tent, there was nothing there. That was enough. As soon as it was light, I packed up my gear. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother cleaning up the campsite. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking. The whole way back, I felt it. That presence. That sense of being watched. I moved fast, my heart pounding with every step. The trees felt closer than before, the air heavier. Then, just as I reached my truck, I saw something. Footprints, leading from the tree line, barefoot, large. They stopped a few feet from my truck. Whoever, whatever, had been watching me had come close. Too close. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed solitude. Some people found the idea of being alone in the woods unsettling. But for me, it was peaceful. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being completely removed from everything. It was something I looked forward to. This trip wasn't anything out of the ordinary. 3 nights alone in the forest, just like I had done many times before. I had picked a spot deep in a national forest, miles away from the nearest road. It wasn't an official campsite, just a place I had found on a map, far from anyone. That was the way I liked it. I packed my gear carefully, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for the trip, a small hatchet, my hunting knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I never went into the wilderness without it. Animals were one thing, but I had read enough stories to know that people could be just as dangerous in remote places. The drive took most of the morning. The main road turned into a dirt path, winding through the trees. Eventually, I had to park and hike the rest of the way in. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, blocking out most of the sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Took me about an hour to reach my chosen spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by thick forest. The ground was mostly flat, and there was plenty of dry wood around for a fire. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anything falling on me if a storm rolled in. After getting my camp in order, I gathered wood and started a small fire. As the sun started to set, I ate a quick meal and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it. The forest was silent, which wasn't unusual, but it was a kind of silence that made me uneasy. No insects, no distant rustling in the undergrowth, just the sound of the fire crackling. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the temperature had dropped just enough to keep the bugs away. Maybe the wind had shifted, making it harder to hear the usual night sounds. Still, I kept my rifle close as I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. At some point, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and outside, everything was still. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavier. They stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe more than that. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal. No broken branches, no footprints. I started to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day trying to shake the feeling. I gathered more wood, checked the area for any signs that someone had been nearby. But there was nothing. By evening, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Just paranoia. Then, as I was sitting by the fire, sharpening my knife, I noticed something. The trees just beyond the clearing, something was there. Not moving, just standing. Couldn't make out details. It was too far, and the light was fading. But there was a shape. Human. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, staring into the trees. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. The shape shifted, almost like it was stepping back into the darkness. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, my rifle across my lap. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew better. At some point, just before dawn, I heard something behind my tent. A deep, slow breathing. Not mine. I turned, gripping my rifle, but by the time I crawled out of the tent, there was nothing there. That was enough. As soon as it was light, I packed up my gear. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother cleaning up the campsite. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking. The whole way back, I felt it. That presence. That sense of being watched. I moved fast, my heart pounding with every step. The trees felt closer than before, the air heavier. Then, just as I reached my truck, I saw something. Footprints, leading from the tree line, barefoot, large. They stopped a few feet from my truck. Whoever, whatever, had been watching me had come close. Too close. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. I had been camping alone for years, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I wasn't one of those people who went into the woods unprepared, without a plan. I always had the right gear, the right supplies, and a backup plan in case anything went wrong. I trusted myself out there. The woods had never scared me. This trip wasn't supposed to be any different. I had planned a 3-day solo trip deep in a national forest, miles away from the nearest road. I wanted complete isolation. No other people, no sounds of traffic, just the quiet of nature. I had spent hours studying the map, marking out a good spot by a small lake, far enough from any trails that I wouldn't run into anyone. I packed my bag carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, my hunting knife, a small hatchet, flashlight, extra batteries, a fire starter, and my rifle. I never went into the wilderness without it. Animals weren't usually a problem, but I'd heard enough stories about people running into the wrong kind of company out in places like this. The drive took most of the morning. The paved road turned into a dirt path, and eventually, I had to park my truck and hike the rest of the way in. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the trees towering over me as I walked. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, but I liked the feeling. It made me feel prepared, ready for whatever the forest had in store. The hike took longer than I expected. The terrain was rougher than it had looked on the map, and by the time I reached the lake, the sun was already low in the sky. The spot was perfect: flat ground, plenty of firewood, and a clear view of the water. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that I wouldn't wake up with a tree branch falling on me. By the time I got my fire going and ate a quick meal, the sun had disappeared behind the trees. The sky turned dark, the stars coming out one by one. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood, watching the reflection of the flames in the lake. Then I noticed something. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of the fire. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the temperature had dropped just enough to keep the bugs quiet. Maybe I was imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. I lay completely still, listening. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. My rifle was next to me, but I didn't dare move to grab it. The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then the footsteps started again, moving away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal after all. A deer, a bear, something harmless. But then I saw the footprints. Human, barefoot, leading from the trees to my tent, stopping just outside. I stood there, staring at them, my stomach tightening. I scanned the tree line, my rifle in my hands. Nothing. No movement. I spent most of the day trying to shake the feeling. I walked around the area, looking for any signs of a campsite, a fire pit, anything that suggested someone else was out here. But there was nothing. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the footprints were old. Maybe they had been there before I set up camp, and I just hadn't noticed. Then, as I was gathering firewood, I saw something, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the darkness. I grabbed my rifle and walked back to my camp, my skin crawling. I kept the fire burning bright that night, my rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard them again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at my tent. They circled it. Slow. Deliberate. I gripped my rifle, my hands shaking. I wanted to unzip the tent, to see whatever was out there. But something in me told me not to. Then the footsteps stopped. I sat there, staring at the tent wall, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, the sun started to rise. I unzipped the tent slowly, my rifle ready. The footprints were back, circling my tent. But there was something else. A handprint, pressed into the fabric of my tent, just inches from where my head had been. That was enough. I packed my gear in record time. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother taking anything I didn't need. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking. The whole way back, I felt it. That presence. That sense of being watched. I moved fast, my heart pounding with every step. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. Then, just as I reached my truck, I saw them. Footprints, leading from the tree line, stopping a few feet from my truck. Whoever, whatever, had been watching me had come close. Too close. I threw my gear into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I never went back. I always camped alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked it that way. No distractions, no small talk, just me and the woods. It was the one place where I didn't have to think about anything except the next fire, the next meal, the next morning. I had taken dozens of solo trips over the years, but this one was going to be the deepest I had ever gone. I had spent weeks planning it, tracing routes on the map, marking out possible sites. No trails, no roads, just deep forest and the promise of silence. I told myself this would be the trip I remembered for the rest of my life. I wasn't wrong. I left before sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a hatchet, my rifle. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 miles on a rough dirt road that felt like it hadn't been maintained in years. When I finally reached the spot where I had to leave my truck, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the tree line, feeling the weight of the isolation ahead. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the ground was clear, the kind of place where you could feel the silence settle in your bones. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek, set down my pack, and took a long drink from my canteen. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only movement was the water and the occasional bird flitting through the branches. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rock face on one side. The kind of place where I could sit with my back against the stone, looking out at the woods, knowing nothing could come at me from behind. I set up my tent near the rock wall, cleared out a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a meal out of a vacuum-sealed bag, watching the flames flicker. That was the last normal moment of the trip. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just thick, suffocating stillness. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere just beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, another footstep. Closer. I sat up slowly, gripping the rifle, my eyes scanning the darkness. My fire had burned too low to see far, just enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The eye strained my ears. Silence. After what felt like an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the fire. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I threw more wood on the fire, watching as the flames flared up, pushing back the dark. Then I saw it. A shape just at the edge of the light. Tall. Still. Watching. I jerked my rifle up, my hands shaking. My breath came fast, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there for the rest of the night, my back against the rock, my rifle in my lap. Morning came slow. The woods were back to normal. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Almost. I searched the ground where the figure had been.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was too deep in my own head. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day gathering wood, walking the area, trying to focus on anything except the lingering unease. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shift in the wind made me grip my rifle tighter. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The zipper on my tent. Moving. Something was outside. Something was trying to get in. I lunged for my rifle, yanked back the bolt. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, footsteps, fast, retreating into the trees. I sat there, my pulse slamming in my ears, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn was slow. I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff with tension. The air was cold, the fire just smoldering coals. Then I saw it. A single handprint on the outside of my tent. Not an animal. Not my imagination. A human handprint. It was time to leave.
I packet fast. No breakfast, no lingering.
I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started walking. I moved fast, almost running. The woods felt different now, watching, waiting. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Then, after a few miles, I saw something that made my stomach turn to ice. A tree, with something carved into the bark. My name. I turned and ran. The rest of the hike was a blur. Just the pounding of my boots, the hammering of my pulse. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck just as the sun dipped below the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching. I slammed the truck into drive, tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not breathing until I hit pavement. I never went back. I decided to go camping alone. I had done it before plenty of times, but this trip was different. I wasn't sticking to the usual campgrounds. I wanted real solitude, somewhere deep in the woods where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the whole point. I picked a spot in a national forest, far off any marked trails. I had studied the maps, checked the terrain, and made sure I had everything I needed. Plenty of food, a good tent, extra layers, a sharp knife, and my rifle. Not that I expected to need the rifle, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's better to have it. The drive out was long. First, it was pavement, then a winding gravel road, and finally a narrow dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached a good place to park, I was already deep into the forest. The The trees pressed in on all sides, thick and dark, the kind of place where cell service didn't exist. I grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and hiked in. It was about an hour to the clearing I had chosen. No signs of recent campers, no trash, no fire pits, no footprints. Just untouched wilderness. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent near a small stream, got my fire going, and settled in. As the sun lowered, the woods filled with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Felt alive, and that was comforting. But as night fell, the noises changed. The usual sounds faded. No more birds, no more insects, just the whisper of the wind in the trees. I noticed it, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the temperature dropping. Maybe a predator nearby, a fox, maybe even a cougar, making everything else go still. I had my rifle. I wasn't worried. I ate my meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the quiet. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. That's when the unease started. I shook it off and turned in for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to faintly glow through the walls of my tent. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not close but not far, somewhere in the trees. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat. Then another snap, closer this time. This wasn't some small animal moving through the underbrush. The steps were careful, deliberate, human. I reached for my rifle, sliding it close. My hand was steady, but my pulse was racing. Who the hell would be out here? There were no trails.
No campgrounds.
No reason for anyone to be this far off the grid. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I lay there, heart hammering, waiting. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to close my eyes. And then a sound. Breathing. Soft. Slow. Just outside my tent. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't an animal. Someone was standing inches from my tent, listening. I gripped my rifle tight, ready to rip open the tent and confront whoever was there. But I hesitated. What if they had a gun? What if they were waiting for me to make the first move? I held my breath, waiting. The breathing continued, steady and calm. Then slowly it faded. Footsteps moving away, back into the trees. Slow, measured, like they weren't in a hurry, like they wanted me to know they were leaving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, rifle in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. At first light, I got out of my tent, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. The forest was still, quiet. I walked the perimeter of my campsite.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast. No breakfast, no fire. Just stuffing my gear into my pack as quickly as I could. I wasn't sticking around. The hike back to my truck felt longer. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps again. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone watching. I reached my truck, threw my gear in, and got in fast, locking the doors out of instinct. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. I turned onto the dirt road, speeding down it faster than I should have, heart pounding, eyes scanning the mirrors. No one followed. I made it back to civilization without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They weren't camping. They had no reason to be there. And they were watching me. I haven't been camping alone since. I was alone in the woods, far from any road or town. deep in the thick of a national forest where the trees stood like ancient walls, their trunks rough and weathered. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the underbrush, the chirping of unseen birds, and the quiet whistle of wind slipping through the canopy. I had planned this trip for weeks, 3 days alone, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything, the noise of the city, the stress of work, the endless notifications on my phone. I didn't bring it with me.
No GPS, no Messages, no Distractions.
Just a paper map, a compass, and a tent strapped to my back. The first day was peaceful. I hiked through miles of forest, following a winding trail that twisted through valleys and over ridges. The trees here were tall and packed tight, their branches so thick that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor in some places. When I stopped for a break, I could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional distant snap of a branch. I set up camp in a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, making a soft, trickling sound. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, a good view of the surrounding woods, and easy access to fresh water. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The darkness in the woods beyond my little campsite was absolute. Without the fire, it would have been like staring into a void. I should have slept well that night, but I didn't. I woke up more than once to silence so deep it made my skin crawl. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just complete, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was out there, watching. The next morning, I pushed the unease aside. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I packed up my things and continued hiking deeper into the woods, away from the more traveled paths. I wanted to be completely alone out here. By midday, I reached a steep ridge that overlooked a dense valley. I climbed down carefully, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. The air down here felt different, thicker, almost heavy. The trees grew taller, their branches twisted, their trunks covered in deep grooves. The undergrowth was dense, filled with ferns and tangled roots. As I moved through the valley, I saw something that made me stop. A tree with long, deep claw marks running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. Some kind of animal, I figured. A bear, maybe. I moved on, keeping my eyes open for any sign of large predators. I had bear spray in my pack, but I knew that wouldn't help much if I startled something big. An hour later, I stumbled upon something stranger. A small pile of bones at the base of a tree. They were clean, white, picked dry. Too small for a deer. Maybe a rabbit, but there were a lot of them. Scattered, as if something had been feeding here. I kept moving. The day passed slowly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed little things that felt off. Trees with deep gouges in the bark. Patches of ground that looked like they had been dug up. Twisted branches that seemed to have been broken recently. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp before it got dark. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and built a fire. As I was gathering wood, I noticed something in the dirt nearby, a footprint. It was large, bigger than my own boot print. But what unsettled me wasn't the size. It was the shape. The front half looked normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever made it had been limping or dragging one leg. The fire felt like a weak barrier against the vast darkness beyond its reach. As I sat beside it, I kept my ears open, listening for anything unusual. The sounds of the forest had returned, chirping insects, the occasional rustle of leaves. But every so often, I thought I heard something else. A soft shuffling, just beyond the light of the fire. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep moving. I wasn't ready to turn back yet, but something in my gut told me I needed to be more careful. I moved faster that day, hiking hard, trying to push past the feeling that I was being followed. The deeper I went, the worse it got. More clawed trees, more scattered bones, more footprints, always with that dragging gait. By the time the sun began to dip, I knew I had made a mistake going this far. I should have turned back earlier. Now I was too deep into the woods, too far from my starting point. I set up camp in a small clearing, not bothering with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. That night I barely moved. I lay in my tent, listening. Every sound made my heart race. At some point I heard it again, that dragging step moving through the brush. It was slow, deliberate, closer than before. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then, slowly, they moved away, fading into the distance. At first light, I packed up and started back the way I came, moving as quickly as I could. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just walked. Sometime in the afternoon, I reached the creek where I had camped the first night. I felt a small sense of relief. I was getting closer to the edge of the forest. That relief didn't last. On the ground near the water, something was wrong. The rocks had been disturbed, the dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was a single deep footprint. Large, dragging. I didn't stop. I walked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I finally saw the edge of the woods ahead. The sight of my truck, parked where I had left it days before, nearly made me collapse with relief. I didn't look back as I threw my pack into the truck and started the engine. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of civilization. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go that deep into the woods again. I had planned the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: 3 nights alone in the deep woods, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I had done solo trips before, sometimes for just a night, sometimes for a full week. But this time I wanted to go deeper. I wanted real solitude, real wilderness. I studied the maps, picked a spot deep inside a national forest, far from any roads, and packed everything I needed. No phone, no GPS, just a compass, a paper map, and enough supplies to last me until I hiked back. The first day was easy. I parked my truck at the trailhead, locked it up, and started hiking. The woods here were thick, endless trees stretching in every direction. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The sun filtered through the canopy in patches, leaving long shadows that moved as the wind rustled the leaves. I followed a narrow, unmarked trail that wound through hills and valleys, past dry creek beds and moss-covered rocks. It wasn't a path most people used. That was the point. I didn't want to run into anyone. By mid-afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, shallow but enough to filter and drink. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and sat by the water for a while, just listening to the forest. The sounds of the woods were familiar: birds chirping, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that noise was a good thing. Silence was what you didn't want. That first night, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal for my pack. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the trees. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the treetops. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the dark, enjoying the quiet. At some point, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that something was off. The fire crackled, the woods whispered with the wind, but underneath it all, there was something else, a feeling more than a sound. I told myself I was imagining it. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before. The mind plays tricks when there's nothing but darkness around you. I forced myself to ignore it and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. I woke up more than once, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. The woods weren't silent, but the sounds felt wrong, like they weren't coming from where they should be, like something was moving, circling, just outside the range of my fire, but I never heard anything close. Just the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, some small animal moving through the brush. I convinced myself of that and fell back asleep. The next morning, I shook off the unease and packed up. I wanted to hike deeper before setting up my second camp. The plan was to make a loop, covering about 15 miles over 3 days, then circling back to my truck. I walked for hours, pushing through thick brush, following the terrain as it sloped downward into a valley. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. The trees were older here, their trunks thick, their roots gnarled and tangled. The undergrowth was untouched, no signs of people passing through. By midday, I came across something strange, a tree with deep, parallel scratches running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed would still pale. They were too high up to be from a small animal, too clean to be natural. A bear, I told myself, had to be. I moved on, keeping an eye out for more signs of wildlife. I wasn't scared, but I was more aware now, more careful. I tightened the straps on my pack and adjusted the bear spray on my belt, just in case. A few miles later, I found another strange thing. A pile of bones at the base of a tree. Small, clean, picked dry. Probably a rabbit or something similar. But there were a lot of them. More than I would expect. Again, I told myself it was nothing. Nature is messy.
Predators Hand, Animals die.
That's just how it is. Still, I moved faster. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing that seemed like a good place to set up camp. I was exhausted from hiking all day, and I didn't want to push further into the woods without enough daylight left. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire. As I set up camp, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Another footprint. It was large, larger than my own boot print. But that wasn't what made me uneasy. It was the shape. The front half was normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever left it had been limping or pulling something behind it. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. There was no way a bear made that. No way it was an animal at all. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds. I told myself it was old, maybe distorted by the rain, by the way the ground settled. I had no better explanation. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, back against a tree, listening. Every sound made my pulse jump. The wind felt colder. The shadows stretched further. At some point, I heard it. Not close, but not far. A slow, shuffling movement through the brush. The same dragging step. I held my breath, gripping the knife in my lap. The sound moved past my camp, just beyond the tree line, never stopping, never hesitating. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back the way I came. I wasn't going to finish the loop. I wasn't going deeper. I just wanted out. I walked fast, covering miles without stopping. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. By midday, I reached the stream where I had camped the first night. My original trail wasn't far now. Just a few more miles, and I'd be back at my truck. Then I saw it. Something had disturbed the ground near the water. Rocks overturned, dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was another footprint. Fresh, still damp, I didn't stop. I hiked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until the trees began to thin and I saw the clearing where I had parked. The sight of my truck nearly made me collapse with relief. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the highway, until the forest was nothing but a dark blur in my rearview mirror. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing, whatever it wasn't lost. It was following me, and it let me go. This time.